All right, so let's talk about the third and final essay that's going to appear on your AP Literature exam, called the Open Response for Question 3. So the first two questions we've seen before. You've done a poetry analysis FRQ and a prose analysis FRQ. Both of those are really similar in that the task will outline something specific like the impact of a setting or the complex relationship between two things. But in general, you're doing the same thing, picking out techniques and explaining how they contribute to that meaning. But question 3 is a little bit different in that, one, they're not providing you a text, so that's where you will use novels like your Quarter 1 novel, or now we're reading Sing Unburied Sing, or you can also use plays. So you're kind of drawing from the list of books you've read previously to answer the question they provide. So here's a sample of what question 3 looks like. Like normal, it has the question number and the suggested time at the top. This one reads, in literary works, cruelty often functions as a crucial motivation or major social or political factor. Select a novel, play, or epic poem in which the acts of cruelty are important to the theme. Then write a well-developed essay analyzing how cruelty functions in the work as a whole and what the cruelty reveals about the perpetrator and or victim. You may select a work from the list below or another work of equal literary merit. Do not merely summarize the plot. And then there's a list of plays. So you'll notice that the first paragraph really lays out, the task. Anytime we see that expression, then write a well-developed essay analyzing, that's usually kind of a signal of what we're supposed to do. And for this particular question, we're supposed to answer how cruelty functions in the novel. So we'll look at a sample of what that is. But one thing to think about with these questions is you can take those ideas a little bit loosely. I think the first thing that comes to our mind when we think of cruelty is maybe like a physical cruelty between characters or unkindness between characters, but cruelty can also be self-inflicted. So you could talk about how a character is hard on themselves, how a character kind of creates situations for themselves that are unhealthy. That idea of cruelty can kind of be a pretty broad take on that big idea, and that can sometimes help you pull from the novels you're more comfortable with if you can kind of make the prompt work. And I say that because while it does provide this list of texts here at the bottom, they're irrelevant. They're suggestions, they're things to consider, but you don't even need to read it. If there is a book of literary merit like those we'll read in class this year that you can connect to cruelty, then you can absolutely use it. I think sometimes people feel like they have to use one of the books on the list, but you certainly don't have to. It just has to be a book of some literary merit, which would mean something that's worth analysis, that has those thematic big ideas and careful writing and development. So this is what the prompt looks like. The first paragraph will kind of lay out what you need. It does have that little note about not summarizing, which is very easy to do with question 3. So definitely focus on avoiding that in our writing. So what's different, what's the same about question 3 compared to the other? The first thing is that the task is going to be different every time. You're not talking about narrative techniques like mood, tone, setting, whatever else that we do with poetry and prose analysis or in question 1 and 2. Now the task is going to be different every time. So it's really important to read carefully to make sure that you are writing on task. For the one we just looked at, that task would be how cruelty functions in the work as a whole and what it reveals about the people involved. So task is always different. Take your time, make sure you really focus in on that. Text is different because prose and poetry will give you the passage. Question 3 is allowing you to choose. Ignore the list. Like I said, it can throw you off if you don't see the book that comes to mind on the list. It doesn't matter. If we've read it in class, it's a viable option. And if it seems to fit the prompt you're looking at, then go for it. It doesn't matter if it's on the list or not. Format is also different. I think pre-writing is especially important for question 3. To avoid just summarizing, you need to take that time up front to make sure that you are addressing the question and really laying out an essay that's on task and not just telling me what happens in the book. And like it says, you should always pre-write, but I think it's particularly important with question 3, and I'll show you an example of that in a second here. And then the next thing that's kind of tricky about question 3 is evidence. So the test isn't till May, and some of you finished your quarter 1 book probably at the end of September for some of you. That means it's going to be a considerable amount of time between tests and when you maybe write about that book. So it can be hard to remember specifics, but that's kind of what you have to do. You can't just make general observations from the book. You need to be as specific as you possibly can. So recalling certain scenes, if you can, recalling certain quotations, that's pretty hard unless you're really comfortable with the book. But it needs to be so specific that I could go look it up in a book. You don't necessarily need to quote, but I should be able to find it. So that's kind of what's unique about question 3. Let's kind of dig into what an essay would look like by starting with the pre-writing I talked about. So I'm using the same prompt. What role does cruelty have on a work as a whole, as well as what does it reveal about perpetrator and victim? So a question like that, can be kind of hard to formulate a thesis because we can't really use our go-to, I guess, fill-in-the-blank analytic thesis like we can with prose and poetry. But I think the biggest part of that task is what it says about perpetrator and victim. So I wanted to make sure that I'm clear on who those are. And I'm going to use The Great Gatsby, obviously. I always do. But the perpetrators, in my opinion, would be Tom and Daisy, and their victim is Gatsby. So when I'm thinking about my thesis and what I want that to look like kind of in general terms, I would say that cruelty in this case wasn't enough to ruin Gatsby's hope. And it clearly reveals that Tom and Daisy were careless, unkind, things like that. So I started with just a general statement, a thematic statement like we've talked about before, about cruelty and hope. And then I've identified my perpetrator and my victim. So then what does that look like as my actual thesis sentence? Pretty much the same. I just wanted to specifically tie in my characters now. So I say cruelty, even that of Tom and Daisy, could not completely destroy Gatsby's hope. So essentially what I did is I started with just a general thematic statement about cruelty and hope. I specified the perpetrators and victims I'm going to talk about, and I kind of smooshed those things together to create one sentence where I'm expressing that theme, but also outlining who that perpetrator is and who that victim is. So I have essentially taken my thesis and put it within the context of my chosen novel. So then here is my sample essay, and I'll kind of read through this a little bit quickly, but it is 2 body paragraphs building on that argument that I laid out about cruelty and hope with The Great Gatsby. So let's read the first body paragraph. Tom and Daisy Buchanan embody the cruelty of carelessness and insincerity. The fickle sincerity of those two becomes most apparent in the hotel scene. While Daisy and Gatsby planned the outing as a way to tell Tom the truth, we see just how insincere Daisy ultimately is. At one point, Daisy announces she's leaving Tom, but the party breaks up when Tom questions Gatsby's reputation and he loses his temper. In less than an hour, Daisy abandons Gatsby and asks for Tom to take her home. This sudden change of heart shows just how shallow and insincere Daisy's love for Gatsby was. Later in the novel, Nick encounters Tom years later and is disgusted by him, declaring that Tom and Daisy were careless with people. This carelessness, which ultimately resulted in Gatsby's death, captures how cruel the Buchanans were in essentially discarding him. Nonetheless, this cruelty was not enough to completely destroy Gatsby's hope. The last time Nick sees Gatsby, he is about to go for a swim while he waits for a call from Daisy. Despite the fact that she eventually just abandoned him for her husband, he still believes she will call. In other words, no matter how cruel she was to him, his hope for a happy future is unchanged. This reveals how cruelty was unable to conquer hope. So a few things I want to point out. I've kind of, in the margins, broken it down for you. But I organized this essay by my perpetrator and my victim. So that was part of my prompt. If you remember, let's just take a quick look back at the prompt. The second part is that I need to explain what cruelty reveals about the perpetrator and victim, and then how it works in the work as a whole. Anytime it says how it functions in the work as a whole, It's just asking for theme and kind of making sure you connect to that bigger meaning. So I organized using the second part of that task. First paragraph, I talk about Tom and Daisy as the perpetrators. Second paragraph, I talk about Gatsby as their victim. But you'll notice at the end of each paragraph, I make a connection to that overall theme I had about cruelty and hope. So that's kind of where I have that link to thesis at the very end of each of the paragraphs. So I guess to sum it up, the trickiest part about open response is narrowing in on the task and then organizing it. It's pretty easy to organize a prose analysis or a poetry analysis because each paragraph is just a different technique. But in this case, you have to decide what are those main points you're going to make and how are they going to successfully address the whole prompt. So for mine, obviously I want to talk about how it functions in the work as a whole. That's where I got my thematic statement about cruelty and hope. But then in terms of how I wanted to organize that, like I said, I separated it out by perpetrator and victim. I just made sure that at the end of my body paragraphs, I made sure to come back to that work as a whole so that I was addressing both parts of the task throughout the entire essay.